Germany had the best trained army in the world. It had the most advanced tank technology of the early war years. It had generals who had studied warfare their entire lives and a military machine that had swept through France, Poland, and North Africa in a matter of weeks. And then it ran into a country that had been at peace for 20 years, with an army that barely existed, and an industrial base that had never built weapons at scale. What the United States did between 1941 and 1945, not just on the battlefield, but in laboratories, factories, boardrooms, and code rooms, was one of the most concentrated applications of organized intelligence in the history of modern warfare. This is how American thinking broke the German war machine. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and Germany declared war on the United States 4 days later, the American military was, by any objective measure, not ready for a conflict of this scale. The United States Army ranked 17th in the world in size in 1939, smaller than Romania's. The Army Air Forces were equipped largely with aircraft already obsolete by European standards. The Navy was damaged. The draft had only been reinstated in 1940, and the men coming through it were months from basic competence, let alone combat readiness. What the United States had, in a form no other nation on Earth could match, was industrial capacity. The scale of American manufacturing mobilization between 1941 and 1945 remains, in the judgment of most economic historians, the single most dramatic industrial transformation ever accomplished by a modern economy in a compressed time frame. To understand what that transformation meant in practice, the numbers have to be held against each other. In 1939, American aircraft production was approximately 2,000 planes per year. By 1944, it was over 96,000. Over the course of the war, the United States produced more than 300,000 military aircraft. Germany produced approximately 120,000 in the same period, and by 1944 was losing planes faster than it could replace them. Tank production followed the same pattern. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced over 88,000 tanks. German tank production over the same period was less than 25,000. And the Germans were fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. Ships. The United States produced 2,710 Liberty ships between 1941 and 1945. These were standardized cargo vessels, designed to be built quickly using prefabricated sections welded rather than riveted together, a technique pioneered by industrialist Henry Kaiser. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, set a world record in November 1942 by assembling a Liberty ship from keel to launch in 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes. The average build time, by the middle of the war, had dropped to under 40 days, compared to the pre-war standard of approximately 8 months. The man most directly responsible for organizing this transformation was not a general or a politician. He was a former automobile executive named William Knudsen, who had run General Motors. In January 1941, President Roosevelt called Knudsen into the Oval Office and asked him to organize American industry for war production. Knudsen accepted, took a commission as a lieutenant general, and went to work using personal relationships and manufacturing expertise to turn a consumer economy into a war production machine at a scale Germany's planners had not considered possible. Germany's intelligence assessments of American industrial capacity in 1941 were, in retrospect, catastrophically underestimated. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, later wrote that when he first saw the production figures being achieved by American factories in 1943 and 1944, he understood the war was lost in purely material terms. Germany was producing weapons of exceptional quality, designed with extraordinary precision, and could not come close to matching the volume of what was coming off American assembly lines. Quality against quantity is a genuine strategic choice. Germany made it, and it did not work. But raw production numbers, however staggering, are only part of the story. What American engineers and scientists were doing inside those factories, and in the laboratories connected to them, is where the real ingenuity begins. Of all the technical achievements produced by American science during the Second World War, there is one that is less well known than the atomic bomb, but that military historians argue had a more immediate and measurable impact on the outcome of the fighting in Europe. It was called the proximity fuse, and it was one of the most consequential pieces of military technology developed during the war. To understand why it mattered, you first need to understand how artillery shells and anti-aircraft rounds had always been detonated. Before the proximity fuse, an artillery shell aimed at an aircraft or at troops in the field would explode either on impact, when it hit something solid, or at a preset time, based on a mechanical timer that the gun crew set before firing. Both methods had serious limitations. Impact detonation required actually hitting the target, which against a fast-moving aircraft was extraordinarily difficult. Time-delayed detonation required knowing precisely how far away the target was, and calculating the shell's flight time to that distance. A calculation that could be thrown off by wind, temperature, atmospheric pressure, and the target's own movement. Anti-aircraft fire in the early years of the war was statistically so ineffective that it took, on average, thousands of rounds to bring down a single aircraft. The shells were exploding near planes, but not near enough. The proximity fuse solved this problem by placing a miniaturized radar system inside the nose of the shell itself. As the shell flew through the air, it continuously emitted radio waves. When those waves bounced back, meaning the shell had come close enough to a solid object, the returning signal triggered detonation automatically. The shell no longer needed to hit the target or match a preset timer. It detonated when it was close enough to do damage. The engineering problem was immense. The fuse had to contain a functional radio transmitter, receiver, and detonation circuit, small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, while surviving an acceleration force of roughly 20,000 times the force of gravity at the moment of discharge. It had to work in rain, cold, heat, and pressure changes, be safe to handle before firing, and reliable enough to function in combat. The project was classified at the highest level. Development was divided across multiple research institutions. The Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory took the lead, working alongside laboratories at the National Bureau of Standards, the Carnegie Institution, and manufacturing partners including RCA. The work began in 1940 and took over 3 years to produce a reliable, mass-producible design. The fuse was first used in combat by the United States Navy in January 1943 against Japanese aircraft in the Pacific. The results were immediate and dramatic. Ships equipped with proximity fuse anti-aircraft shells shot down significantly more attacking aircraft than those using conventional ammunition. The Army began using proximity fuses in land artillery in the summer of 1944 after the Normandy landings, under strict rules that prohibited their use in areas where they might be captured by German forces intact before they had been sufficiently mass-produced to render capture pointless. The first significant use in European ground combat came during the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive in the West, launched in December 1944. When German infantry crossed open ground during the Bulge, American artillery using proximity fuses detonated shells above the soldiers rather than in the ground in front of them. A shell exploding in the air above a formation produces lethal fragmentation across a wide radius, with no earth to absorb the blast. German commanders reported artillery more lethal than anything they had encountered on the Eastern Front. The chief of the German Army's technical branch, examining the effectiveness of American artillery during this period, attributed a substantial portion of the infantry casualties sustained in the Bulge to the proximity fuse, a weapon German engineers had attempted to develop but had been unable to miniaturize reliably. The proximity fuse changed the arithmetic of the battlefield in ways that no amount of German tactical skill could compensate for. But it was not the only technological edge the Americans brought to Europe, not by a long way. By 1944, the Allied air forces had achieved sufficient strength over Europe to move beyond simply contesting German air power and begin systematically targeting the infrastructure that kept the German military functioning. The question was, what to hit? The debate among American and British planners was genuine and sometimes heated. The British Royal Air Force, under Air Marshal Arthur Harris, favored attacking German cities, industrial centers, transportation hubs, civilian morale. The American 8th Air Force, under General Carl Spaatz, argued for what became known as the Oil Campaign, the systematic destruction of Germany's synthetic fuel production facilities. Germany had a significant structural vulnerability that the oil campaign was designed to exploit. The country had almost no domestic petroleum reserves of its own. Its military ran on synthetic fuel, oil produced from coal through a chemical process developed in the 1920s and 1930s called the Fischer-Tropsch synthesis. Germany had built a network of large synthetic oil plants, primarily in the Ruhr industrial region and in what is now Poland, that supplied the majority of aviation fuel and a substantial portion of vehicle fuel for the German armed forces. There were approximately 12 major synthetic oil production facilities in German-controlled territory by mid-1944. They were large, complex, and difficult to relocate. They were also, if sufficiently damaged, practically impossible to replace quickly. Spatz's argument was that if the Allies destroyed these facilities faster than Germany could repair them, the German military would run out of fuel, aircraft would be grounded, tanks would stop, logistics would collapse, training for new pilots, which required enormous quantities of aviation fuel, would cease. The German military machine, however well designed and well led, could not function without petroleum. The systematic oil campaign began in May 1944, with strikes on the Leuna synthetic oil works near Mersburg and other major facilities. The results were almost immediate. German synthetic oil production, which had reached its wartime peak of approximately 316,000 metric tons in March 1944, dropped to 107,000 metric tons in June, and to 17,000 metric tons by September, a reduction of nearly 95% at the worst point. Albert Speer sent Hitler a memorandum in June 1944, warning that if the attacks continued at the same pace, Germany would be unable to sustain military operations by autumn. Hitler did not significantly redirect fighter resources to protect the oil plants. The fuel shortage that followed was catastrophic across every branch of the German military. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had trained thousands of new pilots by 1944, replacing the experienced men lost over years of combat. But it no longer had the aviation fuel to complete their training. These men were sent into combat with 50 to 60 flight hours of experience against American and British pilots with 300 or more. The results were predictable. German pilot losses accelerated, and the pool of experienced aviators that had made the Luftwaffe formidable in 1940 and 1941 was exhausted. German tank crews in the final year of the war began receiving reduced fuel allocations that limited how far and how long they could maneuver. At the Battle of the Bulge, German armored units were given fuel allocations calculated on the assumption that they would capture American fuel depots as they advanced, because there was not sufficient German fuel to sustain the offensive independently. When the American forces they attacked held their positions and the depots were not captured, German armored columns ran dry and had to be abandoned. The P-51 Mustang, the American long-range fighter that provided escort cover for the bombers, deserves recognition here. Before the Mustang, American heavy bombers flying deep into Germany were beyond fighter escort range and suffered catastrophic losses. The Mustang, fitted with drop tanks, could fly from England to Berlin and back, outperforming the primary German fighter at most altitudes and demonstrating to the Luftwaffe that American air power could reach anywhere in the Reich. The oil campaign was a strategic intelligence achievement, the identification of the right point to attack in a system, and the commitment to attack it relentlessly. But there was another form of intelligence operating during these years that Germany never detected and never overcame. The Allied deception operation mounted before the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944, is widely considered the most successful strategic deception in the history of warfare. Its scale, its ambition, and the precision with which it was executed produced results that altered the course of the entire Western campaign. The operation was called Bodyguard, and within it, the component that directly concerned the invasion was Operation Fortitude. Its objective was to convince the German High Command that the main Allied invasion of Western Europe would land not in Normandy, but at the Pas de Calais, the narrow point of the English Channel where the crossing was shortest, and where the approaches to Germany were most direct. This mattered enormously because Germany had positioned its finest armored reserves, including the SS Panzer divisions, within striking distance of the Pas de Calais. If those reserves had been repositioned to Normandy before or during the invasion, the Allied landings would have faced counterattack by the most powerful German armored formations in France within hours of the first troops hitting the beach. The deception worked on multiple levels simultaneously. At the most visible level, the Allies constructed a fictional army group, the 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG, and assigned it a real commander, General George S. Patton, whose reputation the Germans respected more than almost any other American officer. Patton's presence in command suggested to German intelligence that FUSAG was the Allied main effort. An army commanded by Patton, German analysts concluded, was not a diversion. FUSAG existed primarily on paper and in the airwaves. The operation involved the construction of dummy equipment, inflatable rubber tanks, wooden aircraft, fake oil storage depots, positioned in southeastern England opposite the Pas de Calais. German aerial reconnaissance photographed these installations and reported back a massive armored and air buildup exactly where the Allies wanted them to look. The radio deception was even more sophisticated. Entire fake headquarters generated realistic radio traffic, the kind of administrative and operational communications that a real army group of this size would produce. Signal units transmitted schedules, maintenance reports, supply requests, movement orders, all carefully crafted to present a coherent picture of a force preparing to strike at Calais. Underlying all of this was something Germany did not know. Every German spy operating in Britain had been identified and turned by British intelligence through the double-cross system. The agents Germany believed were sending back independent intelligence on Allied preparations were in fact being controlled by British handlers, feeding Germany exactly what the Allied deception planners wanted German intelligence to receive. The Germans had no independent intelligence source in Britain to cross-check what their turned agents were reporting. The American contribution to this deception was substantial. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, commonly known as the Ghost Army, was an American unit of approximately 1,100 men. Many of them artists, designers, sound engineers, and actors recruited specifically for their creative skills. They were deployed across Europe following the Normandy landings to simulate the presence of American units, entire divisions, in locations where no such units existed. The Ghost Army used sonic deception equipment to broadcast recordings of tank movements, engineering construction, and troop activity, audible up to 15 miles away. They wore insignia of real units they were impersonating and sent soldiers into local towns to establish cover identities. They generated fake radio traffic that German signals intelligence would intercept and misinterpret. The Ghost Army conducted 21 deception operations between 1944 and 1945. They impersonated real American divisions more than a dozen times, drawing German attention and forces away from actual American positions. In one operation near the Siegfried Line in September 1944, they simulated the presence of an entire armored division, complete with vehicle sounds, radio traffic, and visual decoys, protecting the flank of a genuine American operation unfolding miles away. The existence of the Ghost Army was classified until 1996, but perhaps the most consequential American intelligence achievement of the war, the one that shaped strategy at the highest level, was not a deception at all. It was the ability to read what Germany was actually planning. The Allied code-breaking effort centered at Bletchley Park in England is more commonly associated with British achievement, and the British contribution, particularly the foundational work of Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman on the bomb machines that broke Enigma traffic, was genuinely central. But American involvement in signals intelligence during the Second World War was substantial, highly capable, and in some theaters, decisive. The United States brought its own cryptanalytic resources into the Anglo-American Intelligence Partnership that formalized in 1943. The Army's Signals Intelligence Service and the Navy's OP-20G, its Signals Intelligence Division, had been developing American code-breaking capabilities since the 1930s. It was an American team under William Friedman at the Army's Signal Intelligence Service that had broken the Japanese Purple Diplomatic Cipher in 1940, before American entry into the war, providing a template for the kind of sustained cryptanalytic effort that the Enigma work required. After Pearl Harbor, the Anglo-American signals intelligence relationship deepened through a series of agreements culminating in the Brusa Agreement of May 1943, which formalized the division of cryptanalytic labor and the sharing of intelligence. American personnel worked alongside British analysts at Bletchley Park, while Arlington Hall in Virginia processed intercepted traffic and contributed to the overall intelligence picture. The intelligence product derived from broken German communications, given the codename Ultra by the British and closely held among a very small circle of senior commanders, gave the Allies a persistent window into German military planning at the operational level. Not every message was broken. Not every broken message was acted upon immediately, because acting on intelligence too quickly or too consistently could alert Germany that its codes were compromised. But over the course of the war, ultra-intelligence shaped Allied decision-making in North Africa, in the Atlantic, in Italy, and in the campaign across Western Europe in ways that multiplied the effectiveness of every other advantage the Allies possessed. In North Africa, ultra-intelligence provided advance warning of Rommel's supply situation, his fuel shortages, his planned movements, giving British and American commanders information about the enemy's capabilities that no amount of ground reconnaissance could have produced. When Rommel planned offensives, Allied commanders sometimes knew about them before the orders had reached his own frontline units. In the Battle of the Atlantic, the German submarine campaign against Allied shipping, signals intelligence was the decisive tool. The ability to read German submarine command communications allowed convoy controllers to route ships around patrol areas. During periods when German naval enigma was readable, convoy losses dropped dramatically. During periods when it was not, losses spiked. The correlation was direct and measurable. By 1944, Germany had no equivalent window into Allied communications. Allied signal security, while not perfect, was substantially better than Germany's, and Germany's signals intelligence services never achieved the level of penetration of Allied communications that Ultra represented in reverse. The senior American commanders who had access to Ultra intelligence understood clearly that it had to be protected at any cost. General Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander in Europe, later assessed that the ultra-intelligence had shortened the war in Europe by no less than 2 years. Intelligence broke Germany's plans before they could be executed. Deception sent German forces to the wrong place at the wrong time. And American industrial production ensured that wherever the right place was, American forces arrived there better equipped than any army in history. But one final American strategic choice, perhaps the most consequential of all, still remained to be made. There is a principle in military history, attributed in various forms to multiple commanders over multiple centuries, that amateurs talk about tactics while professionals talk about logistics. The movement of supplies, food, fuel, ammunition, spare parts, medical equipment, is the infrastructure on which everything else rests. An army that runs out of any one of these things stops fighting, regardless of how skilled its soldiers are or how good its weapons are. The American approach to military logistics during the Second World War represented a genuine strategic innovation, and it was rooted in the same industrial and organizational culture that had produced the production miracle. The Red Ball Express is the most celebrated example. Following the breakout from Normandy in late July and August 1944, American armored and mechanized forces under Patton and others advanced across France at a pace that exceeded all planning assumptions. The logistical system that had been designed to supply a methodical advance was suddenly trying to keep up with forces moving 40, 50, 60 miles per day. The Red Ball Express was the improvised solution. Beginning on August 25, 1944, American transportation units, predominantly African American soldiers, who made up approximately 75% of the truck drivers, ran continuous convoys on dedicated one-way routes across France, from the supply depots in Normandy to the advancing front lines. At its peak, the Red Ball Express was running over 6,000 trucks per day, covering roughly 700 miles of road, delivering up to 12,500 tons of supplies daily. The trucks ran day and night. Drivers slept in shifts and handed off vehicles to fresh crews without stopping. The men who ran it drove under constant time pressure, on roads damaged by weeks of heavy military traffic, in vehicles that broke down regularly and had to be repaired and kept moving. Mechanics worked around the clock. The operation was chaotic by any peacetime standard. It worked. The system supplying American forces in Europe was built on a standardization philosophy that traced directly back to American manufacturing culture. Equipment across the American military was designed with interchangeability in mind. Parts from one vehicle would fit another of the same type. This allowed forward repair units to strip disabled vehicles for parts without waiting for specific replacement components to arrive from the rear. It reduced the complexity of supply lines and the probability of critical shortages at the point of need. The jerry can, the German-designed fuel container that the Americans copied and mass-produced after capturing examples in North Africa, became one of the most quietly important pieces of equipment in the European campaign. The German 5-gallon steel container was far superior to the American fuel container then in use, which leaked and was difficult to handle. American forces reverse-engineered and produced the jerry can in enormous quantities, and it became the standard fuel transport container for the remainder of the war. The ability to move fuel forward quickly and without spillage was a direct enabler of the mobile warfare that characterized the American advance in 1944. American medical logistics also represented a genuine advance over anything Germany fielded. The system of forward aid stations, field hospitals, and evacuation routes that the Army developed during the war dramatically improved survival rates for wounded soldiers compared to any previous conflict. The survival rate for wounded American soldiers who reached a medical facility was higher than in any previous American war, and this was not an accident. It was the product of deliberate organizational design, adequate supply, and the training of medical personnel at a scale Germany could not match by the final years of the war. The logistics, the code breaking, the deception, the technology, and the production, none of these operated independently. They formed a system, and it was the interaction of these elements, all functioning at once, that produced an effect on the German war machine that no single element could have achieved alone. What the United States brought to the Second World War was not simply mass. It was a specific way of organizing human and material resources, a combination of industrial discipline, scientific investment, organizational flexibility, and strategic patience that Germany had not encountered before and had no effective response to. Germany's military in 1939 and 1940 was genuinely formidable. Its officers were trained, its doctrine was innovative, its equipment was well engineered. In the narrow window when it faced opponents it could outmaneuver on terms that favored mobility and surprise, it was devastating. But the war Germany started in 1939 was not the war it was fighting by 1943. The opponent that had materialized on the western side of the conflict operated on a different scale, with different tools, and with a capacity to learn and adapt that the German military, increasingly rigid under Hitler's personal command, could not match. The proximity fuse meant German soldiers in the open died in greater numbers. The oil campaign meant German tanks ran dry and German pilots entered combat half-trained. The deception meant the strongest German armored reserves sat at Calais for weeks after Normandy. The signals intelligence meant German plans were compromised before execution. The logistics meant American forces, however far they advanced, were supplied. None of these were accidents. Each was the product of deliberate thought, sustained investment, and the willingness to apply national resources to problems that had never been solved at this scale before. The men who ran the proximity fuse project at Johns Hopkins, the oil campaign planners at 8th Air Force Headquarters, the Ghost Army's designers and performers, the convoy truck drivers of the Red Ball Express, the signals analysts at Arlington Hall, none of them appear in the standard narratives of the war. The battles and the commanders dominate the histories. But the war was won in laboratories, factories, code rooms, and supply depots as surely as it was won on the beaches and in the forests. Germany's generals understood this. In the end, several of them, writing after the war in memoirs and interviews, described encountering American logistics and technical capability in the field and recognizing that the equation had shifted beyond what tactical skill could compensate for. They had been outfought in a dimension of warfare they had not fully prepared for. The American contribution to the defeat of Nazi Germany cannot be reduced to numbers of men or weapons alone. It was a demonstration of what a society organized around practical problem-solving, industrial capacity, and systematic innovation could accomplish when those qualities were directed toward a single purpose. It took 4 years, it cost hundreds of thousands of American lives, and it worked. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.